Hi, welcome to another episode of Webcam Sessions. Today we're going to work on some concepts with strumming, and specifically we're going to learn how to make our chunks even chunkier. So if you haven't chunked before, it's a unique technique kind of to the ukulele that takes some time to learn. It took me a long time to get it down. And one of the reasons is it's essentially two different motions that happen almost simultaneously, but not quite. And so we're going to start by learning just a little bit about how to do a chunk, if you're not familiar with it. And if you do not know how to chunk, hopefully this helps make it a little chunkier, but we'll be working on some cool concepts with it as we go. So to start, what is a chunk? A chunk essentially is using your strumming hand to mute the strings and create a percussive pop, much like a snare drum. The common misconception is a lot of people think that a chunk can be done by just taking their fretting hand, muting the strings, and doing that, but this is not a chunk. We call this a mute. The chunk is exclusively created with our strumming hand, right? Now I mentioned that it's two different motions that happen nearly simultaneously, and what those two motions are is one is the act of the fingers striking the strings, and the second motion, first, is the palm of the hand muting the strings. And when I say not nearly simultaneous, what that means is the palm is going to mute the strings just before the fingers will strike it. And what fingers are used can be varied. You can use just your index, you can use your index middle, your middle and ring, some combination of those. I typically will use kind of my middle and ring because they're a little bit longer. And what part of the palm changes as well. And we're going to talk a lot more about that in a few moments here on how to make our chunks chunkier. But some part of the palm is going to mute the strings right before our fingers come across to strike it. And you'll notice if you're working on a chunk, it sounds kind of like this, where you're hearing the sound of the strings and then they're immediately muted. That essentially means that you're not muting the strings fast enough. You're actually strumming them and then coming in with a mute. And what you actually want to do is make sure that the palm muting down happens just before the fingers strike the strings, right? Now, what part of the palm can change the tone of the chunk? And that's kind of the point to today's lesson. But hopefully some of these tips with chunking help if you're struggling with chunking. And if you still are having trouble with chunking, I really got to do the shameless plug to promote the course I did with Ukulele Underground, the Ultimate Ukulele Strumming Course, and specifically the not-so-basic strumming that we did with it. That module includes a video on chunking that goes much more in depth into the actual technique of chunking itself, as well as gives you a bunch of different strum patterns and examples to be able to play with it. So if you haven't already, please check that out. But once you're pretty comfortable with a chunk, to the point where you can do a chunk, the next step is varying levels of chunkiness. And the way that this is accomplished is really more based on what part of your palm is muting the strings just prior to the fingers hitting it. So what I find is when I'm playing something that I want a really labored, large chunk sound, maybe something where I'm not chunking quite as much, maybe my pattern's like down, up, chunk, up, down, up, chunk, up, down, up, chunk, up, and I really want that chunk to be this loud, percussive type of sound. I'll tend to use more of the back of my hand and palm to get that mute. I'll use more of this side as I come into the mute. And now I'll also use more of my middle and ring fingers because of the proximity here. By having more of my palm touch the strings, my chunk is going to be a much fatter sound because more hand is muting the strings as it does it. The problem with this is it's also much more inefficient. So it works better for slower patterns, right? So if I'm going to play like a C chord, just ring finger here on 3 of the A, and try doing a pattern like down, up, chunk, up, down, up, chunk, up, and I want those chunks to really be forceful, I'm going to try to use more of the back of the hand to mute as my fingers come down to really get a fat sound. You'll notice I even bring my thumb up and over and really try to get as much of my palm on there as possible. Sounds something like this. You can hear that's a really nice snare drum-like sound, right? And remember, if you're getting this sort of sound, that's because your palm is coming in a little too late. You want to make sure that your palm's coming down and your fingers are striking the strings as it's muting them, right? So That's a very inefficient way of doing a chunk, but it's also a big sound. So if I'm doing something where it's all about the tone and speed is something that's a little slower, I can utilize this technique. But if I'm wanting to chunk much faster and more efficiently, and maybe I don't want quite as much body to the chunk, but I want it to just be more of a little pop, what you can do is essentially move the angle in which you chunk to be more front-ended, and specifically use more of the thumb coming over the strings just like so. So by having the thumb across of them like this, you'll notice it's less hand motion. When I do the full chunk here, I'm trying to get as much of my hand on the strings as possible. But in this case, it's really just here. Now it's a finer motion because if you're off a little bit, the strings are going to ring, but it's a much more efficient one. Now you'll also notice with this type of chunk, I tend to use more of my index finger to do the chunk just because the hand angle is now brought over more this way, right? Much softer though than this chunk, right? So this is really useful if we're playing something that wants to move much quicker, right? So let's say that I'm playing that same C chord, but I want to be playing down, up, chunk, up, down, up, chunk, up, going much faster. Right? You can hear that in that case, it's a much, much smaller sound. It's less pronounced. It draws kind of less attention. But in that speed, it might be something that I'm looking more for. Just a little percussive effect as opposed to something that's really drawing attention to it, right? And what's cool about this is it's really kind of a varying shades of gray, right? Where this is kind of the extreme for that quiet and this is the extreme for that loud, but you can kind of alter the way that your hand is interacting with the strings to get those different levels of chunks. And which fingers attack the strings as well can impact that, right? If I use kind of all three fingers to strike the strings going down and use a lot of the palm to mute, it's going to be a bigger sound of a chunk. But if I only use one finger going down, it's going to be a little bit less just because only one finger is striking the strings. So you can try to play around with this to see what kind of effects you can get with chunking. But let's go ahead and do a couple more examples with this. Let's go ahead and start with that softer chunk. And let's go ahead and play a C chord. And then from that C chord, let's go to an A7 chord. Right? The A7 is going to be just our index finger on the first fret of the C string. Now we're going to do the same pattern. We're going to go down, up, chunk, up. And we're going to do it pretty quickly to get comfortable with that softer chunk type of sound. So I'm going to count us in, and then we're going to try playing it together. Here we go. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and down, up, chunk, up, down, up, chunk, up, down, up, chunk, up, down, up, chunk, up. What you'll notice as I'm doing this, just using kind of the front of the thumb there on that chunk to make it very efficient, using my index finger to come down through it, right? But now let's try the more inefficient chunk to get a fatter sound. And let's do something that's even slower for rhythm. Let's use the same chords, the C and the A7, but this time we're going to go down, and then we're going to miss the strings coming back up. Then we're going to do a chunk, and then we're going to miss the strings coming back up again. And it's kind of tricky to work on missing the strings after doing a chunk. If that's something you struggle with, the course that I did with Ukulele Underground, the Not So Basic Strumming Course, goes a lot into the detail of how that all works. But let's go ahead and try this pattern together. So starting with the C chord, I'm going to count us in here. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and down, miss, chunk, miss, down, miss, chunk, miss, down, miss, chunk, miss, down, miss, chunk, miss. So you'll notice on these, I'm really using my fingers to strike through the strings very forcefully and getting more of the hand involved. And just so you can really hear it, here are the two different patterns kind of used together. All right, so again, one more time there. Softer chunk. Louder chunk. Right? So try experimenting with these, see what you think, and yeah, I will see you next week for another episode of Webcam Sessions. Thank you so much.